A Hell's Angels heard a waitress crying. When she said, "The manager always hurts me," he took action. The late afternoon sun, a tired orange, bled through the grimy windows of Papa Joe's diner, casting long, dusty shadows across the checkered linoleum floor. The air inside was a thick, comforting cocktail of stale coffee, sizzling onions, and the faint, underlying scent of industrial cleaner that never quite managed to penetrate the decades of accumulated grease. Booths upholstered in cracked, faded red vinyl lined one wall, each table adorned with a perpetually sticky plastic sugar dispenser and a metal napkin holder overflowing with thin, rough paper. On the counter, beneath a fluorescent light that buzzed with a low, rhythmic hum, a row of rotating stools stood empty, waiting for the evening rush that might never truly materialize. A low rumble vibrated through the street outside, growing steadily louder until it culminated in the throaty snarl of a Harley-Davidson pulling up to the curb. The engine cut out with a final, defiant cough, leaving an abrupt silence that seemed to amplify the diner's ambient sounds, the clatter of plates from the kitchen, the distant murmur of the radio playing a forgotten country song, and the soft squeak of worn sneakers on the floor. The door swung open, and a figure filled the frame, momentarily silhouetted against the dying light. He was a big man, built like a redwood, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his leather vest. Patches adorned the vest, proclaiming his affiliation in stark, unmistakable detail, the most prominent being the winged skull that was the notorious emblem of the Hells Angels. His hair, a grizzled silver, was pulled back in a neat ponytail, revealing a roadmap of life etched onto his rugged face. A thick, well-maintained beard framed a jawline that suggested a lifetime of unwavering resolve. His eyes, though partially obscured by dark sunglasses, held a quiet intensity that seemed to absorb everything without betraying a single thought. This was Rattlesnake, a name earned not for any particular venomous nature, but for the unsettling calm he exuded before delivering a decisive, often impactful, strike. Rattlesnake stepped inside, his heavy boots making a soft thud on the worn floor. He didn't stride aggressively, but his presence was undeniable, a gravitational pull that seemed to shift the diner's equilibrium. The few scattered patrons, a couple of elderly men nursing bottomless coffees and a lone trucker hunched over a plate of fries, cast quick, surreptitious glances his way, their conversations tapering off into hushed whispers. Rattlesnake ignored them, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced efficiency before settling on an empty booth at the far end, tucked away from the main thoroughfare. He moved with a surprising grace for a man of his size, his leather creaking softly with each step, the faint scent of motor oil and road dust trailing in his wake. He slid into the booth, the vinyl groaning in protest, and took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were a startling shade of ice blue, sharp and observant. He placed the sunglasses on the table beside him, then leaned back, his posture relaxed yet alert. It wasn't often he found himself in a place like Papa Joe's. He preferred the open road, the roar of his engine a constant companion, but hunger was a persistent master, and this diner had been the first place with a open sign he'd seen in miles. A young woman emerged from behind the counter, a notepad clutched in her hand. Her uniform, a faded blue apron over a white shirt, looked a size too big, and her hair, a pale blonde, was pulled back in a messy ponytail that had escaped in several places. Her name tag, pinned slightly crookedly, read Sarah. She was slender, almost fragile, and her movements, though efficient, carried a subtle weariness. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and the corners of her mouth, though attempting a practiced customer service smile, didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Papa Joe's," Sarah said, her voice a little softer than the usual diner chirp, but clear enough. She approached his table, her gaze briefly flickering over his vest before quickly returning to his face, though she avoided direct eye contact with his piercing blue eyes. "What can I get for you?" Rattlesnake looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Coffee, black. And a cheeseburger, all the way. Fries on the side." His voice was a low rumble, surprisingly calm, devoid of any menace. "Coming right up," Sarah replied, scribbling on her pad. She turned to leave, and Rattlesnake noticed a slight tremor in her hand as she moved away. Nothing overt, just a fleeting instability that most people wouldn't catch. But Rattlesnake caught everything. His life on the road, his experiences, had honed his senses to an almost preternatural degree. He didn't dwell on it, though. People were tired, people had bad days. He was here for food, not to dissect the emotional state of the waitstaff. He watched her disappear into the kitchen, the swinging door flapping shut behind her. The diner continued its slow, afternoon rhythm. The elderly men resumed their hushed conversation, the trucker grunted as he wiped his mouth with a napkin. Rattlesnake observed the peeling paint on the ceiling, the faded photographs of local sports teams from decades past adorning the walls, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. It was a place that had seen better days, a relic of a simpler time, clinging stubbornly to existence. A few minutes later, Sarah returned with a steaming mug of black coffee, placing it carefully in front of him. "Here you go. Burger won't be long." "Thanks," Rattlesnake grunted, taking a slow sip. The coffee was strong, bitter, and exactly what he needed. As Sarah turned to attend to another table, he noticed it again. A quick, almost involuntary rub of her left arm, just above the elbow, as if soothing an ache. And then, as she leaned over to wipe down a recently vacated table, a soft, almost inaudible sniffle. He saw her quickly dab at her eyes with the back of her hand before turning away, her shoulders slumping for just a fraction of a second before she straightened them with a visible effort. Now, Rattlesnake was paying attention. It wasn't just tiredness. There was a genuine sadness, a fragility that was trying desperately to hide itself. He watched her move, serving the few patrons, clearing tables, her movements a little too hurried, a little too stiff. He saw her glance towards the kitchen door several times, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes each time it swung open, only to relax slightly when it wasn't the person she seemed to be expecting, or dreading. His cheeseburger arrived, a greasy, satisfying edifice of meat and cheese, piled high with fresh toppings. Sarah placed it down with a quiet efficiency, her gaze still avoiding his. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice a little strained. Rattlesnake took a moment, his blue eyes fixed on her face. "You all right, darlin'?" he asked, his voice low, almost a murmur, but carrying an unexpected weight. Sarah flinched, her shoulders tensing. She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise, a flash of fear mingling with the weariness. Her smile faltered completely. I'm fine," she stammered, too quickly, too unconvincingly. She glanced nervously towards the kitchen door again, then back at him, her gaze darting around the diner as if searching for an escape route. Rattlesnake didn't press, not yet. He just held her gaze, a silent invitation for honesty in his unwavering stare. He took a bite of his burger, chewing slowly, giving her space, but making it clear he wasn't going to let it go. He watched her walk away, her back rigid, her steps a little quicker. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a palpable aura of distress that was growing more difficult to ignore. He finished his meal, savoring the simple comfort of the food. All the while, his peripheral vision tracked Sarah. He saw her disappear into the kitchen, and heard a muffled, sharp voice, too low to discern words, but undeniably harsh. Then, a brief, sharp silence, followed by the clatter of something falling, and a choked sob. This time, there was no mistaking it. Sarah was crying. A slow, cold anger began to simmer beneath Rattlesnake's calm exterior. He wasn't one to meddle in other people's affairs, but there was a line, a fundamental boundary of human decency, that he instinctively felt was being crossed. He placed his napkin beside his empty plate and pushed himself out of the booth, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The few remaining patrons pretended not to notice as his imposing figure rose to its full height. He walked towards the counter, stopping just short of the kitchen door. He waited. In a moment, Sarah emerged, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed and glistening, though she was clearly trying to compose herself. She spotted him and froze, her shoulders hunching almost imperceptibly. "Check, please," Rattlesnake said, his voice still low, but with a new edge that hadn't been there before. Sarah fumbled with her notepad, her hands visibly trembling now. She scribbled the total and presented it to him. As she did, he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, audible only to her. "What's going on, Sarah?" he asked, his blue eyes boring into hers, leaving no room for evasion. "Why are you crying?" Her composure shattered. A fresh wave of tears welled up, spilling down her cheeks. She looked around, her eyes wide with a desperate fear, as if terrified of being overheard. Her voice was a barely audible whisper, choked with emotion. I can't," she stammered, shaking her head. "Please, just take the check." Rattlesnake's gaze hardened. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a wad of bills. He laid a $50 bill on the counter, far more than the check required. His eyes never left hers. "This isn't about the money, darlin'," he said, his voice taking on a quiet, dangerous quality. "Tell me what's wrong." Sarah's breath hitched. Her gaze, filled with raw desperation, finally met his. The fear in her eyes was profound, but so was a glimmer of something else, a desperate plea for help. She glanced towards the kitchen door again, then back at Rattlesnake, her voice barely a whisper, ragged with unshed tears. "The manager," she choked out, the words barely escaping her lips. He always hurts me." The words hung in the air between them, a chilling declaration. Rattlesnake felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The casual hum of the diner, the distant country music, the mundane clatter of dishes, all of it faded into a dull background noise. His entire focus narrowed to Sarah's tear-streaked face, to the profound pain and fear in her eyes, and to those 4 devastating words. "He always hurts me." It wasn't just a complaint, it was a confession of ongoing torment, a cry for help that had finally broken through her carefully constructed facade. A lifetime of navigating the fringes of society, of witnessing raw human nature at its best and its worst, had instilled in Rattlesnake a deeply ingrained, if unconventional, sense of justice. He might live by his own code, outside the bounds of conventional law, but that code had absolute tenets. One of them was that you did not hurt the innocent. You did not prey on the vulnerable. And a young woman, working her tail off in a rundown diner, was as vulnerable as they came. The cold anger that had been simmering now solidified into a block of ice in his chest. His expression, previously unreadable, now held a dangerous stillness. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the kitchen door, the innocuous swinging panel that now seemed to hide a malevolent presence. He didn't need to know the specifics yet, didn't need to understand the exact nature of the hurting. The fact that it was, always, that it created this level of terror in Sarah, was enough. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of old grease and Sarah's fear filling his nostrils. The world outside the diner, the road, his bike, his own affairs, all of it receded. There was only this moment, this girl, and this injustice. His mind, usually slow and methodical, began to churn with a cold, precise efficiency. The manager. He had to be dealt with. And Rattlesnake, a man who understood the language of consequence, knew exactly what kind of action was required. He wouldn't leave until he ensured Sarah would never have to utter those words again. The quiet intensity in his ice-blue eyes now held a promise, cold and unyielding, that someone was about to pay a very steep price. He looked at Sarah, a silent message passing between them, a promise that help had arrived, dressed in leather and carrying a heavy burden of intent. He then turned his full attention towards the kitchen door. Rattlesnake pushed through the swinging kitchen door, the heavy panel groaning on its hinges before settling back into place with a soft thud. The air inside was a suffocating blast of heat and steam, thick with the smell of old grease, burnt food, and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights, grimy and flickering, cast a harsh, unforgiving glare on stainless steel surfaces, scarred cutting boards, and overflowing trash bins. Pots bubbled on a stove, a fryer hissed, and the general cacophony of a working diner kitchen assaulted the senses. A man, his back to Rattlesnake, stood hunched over a griddle, flipping burgers with a practiced, almost violent efficiency. He was shorter than Rattlesnake, but broad, with a thick neck and arms that suggested a history of manual labor. His chef's whites, once crisp, were stained with the day's grime, and a greasy baseball cap sat low on his head, covering thinning hair. This had to be the manager. Sarah stood near a prep table, her back still to Rattlesnake, her shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly as she furiously chopped onions, trying to appear busy, trying to disappear. The sound of her choked sobs, previously muffled, was now clearer, a raw, painful sound that cut through the kitchen noise. Rattlesnake took 2 slow, deliberate steps further into the kitchen, his boots making no sound on the slick, tiled floor. He didn't speak, didn't make a grand entrance. He simply existed, his imposing presence a sudden, cold weight in the hot, chaotic space. The manager, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, slowly turned. His eyes, small and beady, widened slightly as they took in Rattlesnake's leather, the patches, and the unyielding stare behind the ice-blue eyes. A flicker of annoyance, then recognition, crossed his face. He'd seen men like Rattlesnake before, usually on bikes passing through town, never in his kitchen. "Can I help you, pal?" the manager grunted, his voice rough, trying to project authority, but there was a subtle tremor in his tone. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag, his gaze darting to Sarah, then back to Rattlesnake. "This is a private area. Customers aren't allowed back here." Rattlesnake ignored the manager's words, his gaze sweeping past him to Sarah. She flinched, dropping the knife she was holding with a clatter that echoed in the sudden, tense silence. Her eyes, red and swollen, met Rattlesnake's for a brief, terrified moment, then darted back to the manager, a silent plea for protection mixed with abject fear. "She says you hurt her," Rattlesnake stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. It wasn't a question, but a cold, undeniable declaration. The manager's face flushed. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain control. "What in the hell are you talking about? I don't know what this crazy broad told you, but she's a liar. Always complaining, always making trouble. Just a sensitive little thing, can't handle the pressure of a real job." He gestured dismissively towards Sarah, a sneer twisting his lips. "Probably just looking for attention." Sarah let out a small, whimpering sound, clutching at her apron, her body trembling. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words seemed to catch in her throat, strangled by fear. Rattlesnake's eyes narrowed, the ice blue deepening to a glacial hue. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The manager instinctively took a step back, bumping into the hot griddle, letting out a small yelp of pain. The smell of sizzling fat intensified around them. "She said, always," Rattlesnake continued, his voice still calm, but with an underlying current of immense power, like a river flowing just beneath the ice. "That suggests a pattern, not a single instance of being sensitive. What kind of manager always hurts his staff, Gary?" He used the manager's assumed name, a subtle assertion of knowledge and control. Gary, startled that Rattlesnake knew his name, stammered, How do you know my name?" "Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to leave. Now. Or I'll call the cops." He tried to sound threatening, but his eyes betrayed his fear, constantly flicking towards Rattlesnake's broad shoulders and the patches on his vest. "You won't call anyone," Rattlesnake said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He stopped just a foot from Gary, towering over him. The heat from the griddle seemed to intensify, but Rattlesnake remained perfectly still, radiating a cold authority. "You're going to tell me exactly what you've been doing to Sarah." Gary's bravado crumbled. He swallowed hard, his gaze darting frantically around the kitchen, looking for an escape, for a weapon, for anything. There was nothing. Just Rattlesnake, silent and unmoving, a wall of leather and muscle. It's nothing." Gary blurted out, his voice cracking. "Just a little push here and there, you know? To get her to work faster. She's slow. And a few words, to keep her in line. She cries at everything. Always so dramatic." He tried to laugh, a nervous, high-pitched sound that died in his throat when Rattlesnake's stare intensified. "A little push." Rattlesnake repeated, the words hanging in the stifling air. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a sudden move. His control was absolute, and that was far more terrifying than any outburst. He slowly, deliberately, reached out a large hand and gripped Gary's shoulder. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was firm, unyielding, a silent promise of immense strength. Gary flinched, his face paling. "Show me," Rattlesnake commanded, his eyes still locked onto Gary's. "Show me how you push her." Gary tried to pull away, but Rattlesnake's grip was like an iron clamp. "No. I didn't mean anything. I swear. Just a bit rough sometimes, that's all. She exaggerates. Sarah, witnessing the scene unfold, slowly straightened up. The immediate terror in her eyes was still present, but a fragile flicker of something else, a nascent hope, began to emerge. Rattlesnake hadn't just heard her, he believed her. And he was standing up for her. Rattlesnake glanced at Sarah, a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah, he said, his voice softer now, directed at her. He says he just pushed you. Is that true? Sarah's breath hitched. She looked at Gary, then back at Rattlesnake, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning courage. He grabs me, she whispered, her voice still shaky, but gaining a fraction of strength. He twists my arm when I'm not fast enough. He calls me names. He throws things if he's angry. And he locks the back door at night sometimes, when I'm cleaning up, and says I can't leave until I learn my lesson. A fresh wave of tears welled up, but this time, they seemed to be tears of release, not just fear. The words hung in the air, chilling and stark. Rattlesnake's grip on Gary's shoulder tightened, the knuckles on his hand turning white. Gary let out a strangled gasp of pain. Is that true, Gary? Rattlesnake asked, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. The calm was gone, replaced by a cold fury that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. You lock her in. You twist her arm. Gary was visibly trembling now, his face a mask of terror. No. She's lying. She's making it up. I never. Rattlesnake didn't let him finish. With a sudden, fluid movement, he spun Gary around, slamming him against the stainless steel prep table. The impact was dull but heavy, making the pots and pans hanging above rattle. Gary gasped, his breath knocked out of him, his eyes wide and unfocused. Rattlesnake didn't release his grip on Gary's shoulder, holding him pinned against the cold metal. You listen to me, Gary, Rattlesnake said, his face inches from the manager's, his voice a guttural whisper that promised swift, brutal retribution. I don't care about your excuses. I don't care if you think she's sensitive or dramatic. What I care about is that you have been hurting this young woman. And that stops. Right now. Gary tried to squirm, to protest, but Rattlesnake's strength was overwhelming. He felt like a child in the grip of a giant. Please don't hurt me, Gary whined, the bully completely broken, his eyes darting to Sarah, then back to Rattlesnake. I'll stop. I swear. I won't touch her again, I promise. A promise isn't enough, Rattlesnake stated, his eyes boring into Gary's. You're going to clean out your locker. You're going to give Sarah tonight's earnings, and then you're going to walk out that door and never set foot in this diner again. Not as a manager, not as a customer. Ever. Understand? Gary nodded frantically, tears starting to stream down his grimy face. Yes. Yes, I understand. I'll go. Just let me go. Rattlesnake slowly, deliberately, released his grip. Gary stumbled forward, clutching his shoulder, rubbing it frantically. He looked at Rattlesnake, then at Sarah, a defeated, pathetic figure. The air of authority he had tried to project was completely gone, replaced by abject fear. Get your things, Rattlesnake ordered, his voice still low, but firm. And don't even think about trying to call anyone. Because if I hear you've even looked in Sarah's direction again, or caused her any trouble, I will find you. And that, Gary, will be the least of your worries. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, a chilling promise of a fate far worse than a simple beating. Rattlesnake's reputation, his emblem, spoke volumes without him needing to utter explicit details. Gary, without another word, scrambled towards a small locker room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah watched him go, her face a mixture of shock, relief, and still, a lingering fear. Rattlesnake turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Are you okay, darlin'? He asked, his voice gentler now, though still carrying that deep resonance. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I think so. I can't believe it. He's actually leaving. A small, shaky smile touched her lips, quickly replaced by a frown of concern. But, what about the diner? Who's going to manage? And my job? Rattlesnake leaned against the prep table, his posture relaxed but still alert. That's not your concern right now, he said. Your concern is your safety. And ensuring this never happens again. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. This diner needs a new manager. Someone who treats their staff with respect. Someone who doesn't always hurt them. He looked around the rundown kitchen, then back at Sarah, a plan already beginning to form in his methodical mind. He knew a few people who understood justice, people who understood how to make things right. Papa Joe's diner might be a relic, but it deserved to be a place where a young woman could work without fear. And Rattlesnake, having set things in motion, wasn't about to leave until he was absolutely sure the new equilibrium was stable. Gary was dealt with, but the system that allowed him to thrive still needed to be addressed. He still had work to do. Gary emerged from the locker room a few minutes later, a small, worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face was blotchy, his eyes still red from tears and fear. He avoided Rattlesnake's gaze, shuffling past him towards the back door. As he reached it, he fumbled with the lock, his hands still trembling. The earnings, Gary, Rattlesnake's voice cut through the kitchen, cold and sharp. Tonight's earnings. And Sarah's tips. Gary froze. He turned slowly, pulling a crumpled wad of bills from his pocket. He counted out a few 10s and 20s, tossing them onto the prep table near Sarah. There, he mumbled, his voice devoid of its earlier bluster. That's everything. He didn't mention the tips, clearly hoping Rattlesnake would forget. Rattlesnake's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew the manager's shift in a diner like Papa Joe's often involved skimming from the till, especially during slower hours. He walked over to the cash register, his heavy boots making a soft thud. With a swift, practiced movement, he opened the drawer. He didn't take all the money, but he carefully counted out a sum he deemed fair for Sarah's lost wages and the general indignity she'd suffered over time, adding it to the pile Gary had left. He also found a small container labeled tips, which was suspiciously empty. He added another 50 from the main till, making the total a substantial amount for Sarah. This is for Sarah, Rattlesnake said, placing the money on the counter in front of her. And this, he added, pulling another wad of bills from his own pocket, a thicker roll this time, is for the next few days. To keep the lights on. We'll figure the rest out. Sarah stared at the money, then at Rattlesnake, her mouth agape. It was more money than she'd seen in a long time. Gary, meanwhile, watched the transaction with a mixture of resentment and impotent rage, but he dared not speak. Now, get out, Rattlesnake commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. And remember what I said. Don't look back. Gary didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran out the back door, the heavy metal slamming shut behind him with a final, echoing clang. The sudden silence in the kitchen was profound, almost deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and Sarah's shaky breathing. Sarah looked at the money, then at Rattlesnake, her eyes welling up again, but this time with overwhelming gratitude. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you so much. I thought I was stuck. Rattlesnake nodded, a flicker of something akin to warmth in his ice-blue eyes. No one should be stuck, darlin'. Not like that. He picked up the knife Sarah had dropped earlier, wiped it clean with a fresh cloth, and placed it back on the prep table. Now, let's talk about what happens next. He led her out of the stifling kitchen and back into the relative calm of the diner. The few remaining patrons had long since departed, leaving the checkered linoleum floor and vinyl booths empty, bathed in the fading light of the late afternoon. He sat her down in a booth, across from him, the money still clutched in her hand. First thing, Rattlesnake began, his voice firm but reassuring, Gary isn't coming back. Ever. I'll make sure of it. He's going to learn a lesson about preying on people. The quiet certainty in his tone left no doubt as to the finality of Gary's fate. Rattlesnake had contacts, and a message from him carried significant weight in certain circles. Gary would find that the world outside Papa Joe's diner could be a far less forgiving place. A few discreet calls would ensure that Gary's reputation would precede him, making it impossible for him to find similar employment in the area, and a quiet word to some of Rattlesnake's associates would ensure that any attempt at retaliation against Sarah would be met with swift and severe consequences. Gary would simply disappear from Sarah's life, a bad memory fading into the background. Second, he continued, this diner needs a reliable hand. Someone who knows the ropes, but also someone with a good heart. You've been here a while, haven't you? Sarah nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. Since I was 18. 5 years. Good, Rattlesnake said, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips. That means you know this place better than anyone. You know the customers, you know the suppliers, you know how it runs. He paused, letting his words sink in. How would you feel about running it yourself? At least for a while. As interim manager. Sarah's eyes widened. Me? Manage? I don't know anything about managing a diner. I'm just a waitress. You're more than that, Sarah, Rattlesnake countered gently. You're dedicated. You're honest. And you care. Those are qualities Gary never had. I'll make some calls. I have friends. People who can help. People who understand how to turn a place around. They can guide you, help you with the books, the hiring, all the things you don't know yet. But you'll be in charge. You'll be the one calling the shots. He pulled out a rugged satellite phone from an inner pocket of his vest. It looked out of place in the diner, a piece of the open road brought into a forgotten corner of civilization. He quickly dialed a number. Snake here, he rumbled into the phone. Yeah, I'm in town. Got a situation. Papa Joe's diner. Needs a new manager, effective immediately. And someone to keep an eye on things for a bit. And maybe a little financial injection to get it back on its feet. Got a good kid here, Sarah. Been getting a raw deal. She's got the heart, just needs the backbone and the know-how. Think you can send someone over? Someone who understands, my kind of justice. He listened for a moment, then nodded. Good. Tell them I'll be here until things are stable. And tell them if they see a guy named Gary trying to sniff around, they send him my way. Or better yet, send him away. He hung up, a grim satisfaction on his face. That was Hammer, Rattlesnake explained to Sarah. He runs a few businesses. Knows how to make things work. He'll send someone. Probably by morning. Someone named Maria. She's sharp. She'll get you set up. Sarah was speechless. A single act of kindness, born from a moment of vulnerability, had turned her entire world upside down. From constant fear and abuse to the prospect of owning her own destiny. The next morning, true to Rattlesnake's word, Maria arrived. She was a woman in her late 40s, with shrewd, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore a tailored suit that seemed to hum with efficiency, a stark contrast to the diner's worn charm. Rattlesnake was already at a booth, nursing a fresh cup of coffee, having spent the night on his bike, parked discreetly nearby, ensuring Gary wouldn't make a foolish return. Maria walked in, her gaze sweeping the diner with a professional eye, then settling on Rattlesnake. Rattlesnake, she said, her voice crisp. Hammer sent me. Says you got a problem that needs fixing. Rattlesnake nodded, gesturing to Sarah, who was nervously wiping down the counter. Problem's mostly fixed. Just need to make sure it stays that way. And help this young lady get on her feet. Maria introduced herself to Sarah, her initial sternness softening slightly as she assessed the young woman's earnestness. So, Sarah, Maria began, pulling out a tablet and a pen, Rattlesnake tells me you're taking over. We're going to get you set up properly. First, we'll do a full audit of this place. Figure out exactly what Papa Joe's needs. Then, we'll get you on a proper payroll, with benefits. No more working for pennies and being abused. You'll be the manager, with a salary that reflects that. And we'll start hiring some new staff, good people, who will treat this place and each other with respect. Maria spent the entire day at the diner, going through old invoices, checking inventory, and discussing the future with a bewildered but increasingly hopeful Sarah. Rattlesnake remained in the background, a silent guardian, observing Maria's efficiency and Sarah's growing confidence. He saw the flicker of life returning to Sarah's eyes, the way her shoulders seemed to relax, the small, genuine smiles that began to appear. As the sun began to set, painting the diner windows in hues of orange and purple, Maria closed her tablet. "All right, Sarah," she said, "we've got a solid plan. I'll have a legal team draw up the paperwork for you to become the official interim manager, with an option to buy the diner outright in a year, if you prove it's viable. We'll provide the initial capital to get things running smoothly, fix up the place a bit, maybe even update the menu. And I'll be checking in regularly. You're not alone in this." Sarah looked from Maria to Rattlesnake, tears welling up again, but these were tears of pure joy and relief. I can't thank you enough," she stammered, overwhelmed. "Both of you. You saved me. You saved this place." Rattlesnake pushed himself up from the booth, his leather creaking softly. His work here was done. Gary was gone, his fate sealed by the unseen hand of Rattlesnake's network. Sarah was safe, empowered, and on a path to a better future, with the backing of people who understood the value of a fair deal. Papa Joe's diner, once a symbol of stagnation and hidden suffering, was poised for a rebirth. He walked over to Sarah, placing a large, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this, darlin'," he said, his voice soft. "Just remember to always treat people right. And don't ever let anyone tell you you're just a waitress again." He gave her a rare, genuine smile, a flash of warmth in his usually stoic expression. He then turned to Maria. "Thanks, Maria. Tell Hammer I owe him one." "Already accounted for, Rattlesnake," Maria replied with a knowing smirk. "You always pay your debts." Rattlesnake walked out of Papa Joe's diner, the familiar scent of stale coffee and sizzling onions now mingled with a faint, fresh scent of hope. His heavy boots made a soft thud on the worn linoleum for the last time. He swung his leg over his Harley-Davidson, the engine roaring to life with a deep, throaty snarl that vibrated through the quiet street. He put on his dark sunglasses, obscuring the ice-blue eyes that had seen so much, intervened so decisively, and now held a quiet satisfaction. As he rode off into the twilight, the rumble of his engine fading into the distance, Sarah watched him go from the diner's doorway. She clutched the money and the new manager's keys in her hand. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. She looked back at the diner, a place that had once been her prison, now her opportunity. She had a lot to learn, a lot of work to do. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt truly free, truly safe, and truly in control of her own life. Rattlesnake, the Hell's Angel who heard a whisper, had brought a quiet, unconventional justice to Papa Joe's, leaving behind a legacy of change and a young woman ready to build her own future, one cup of coffee at a time. The road ahead for Sarah was still long, but it was now a road of her own choosing, free from the shadows of fear and abuse. And somewhere out there, Rattlesnake would continue his journey, a silent force ensuring that justice, in his own unique way, always found its path.